is there universal agreement that allowing Islamic State, though I note your comments in the Parliament yesterday where you said you will not call them Islamic State because it's not a state, it's a death cult, but is there a view that to allow Islamic State to entrench itself and metastasise across the Middle East, is there a view that would be a political and strategic disaster for the West and for the people of the region?
Well, that's the point, Alan. It wouldn't just be a disaster for the West. It would much more be a disaster for the region. And I was able to stop in the Gulf on my way back from Europe recently, and I was able to sit down with one of Australia's friends in that part of the world, an extremely well-connected friend, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, and plainly, the Middle East is just as alarmed by what's going on as we are in the West, because the first victims of any successful ISIL push will be the existing governments of the Middle East, whether it be the Iraqi government, whether it be the Iranian government, whether it be the Saudi government or the Jordanian government, or indeed the Assad regime. Basically, this death cult has it in for everyone and everything that doesn't strictly conform to their own narrow version of what's right in the eyes of God.
That being said, are you getting advice from those to whom you speak that what is so far limited action is unlikely to contain them, let alone begin to roll them back from the vast advances that they've made?
Well, what we've seen so far is limited but effective US airstrikes on the ISIL advance, and those airstrikes did relieve the siege of Mount Sinjar. They have been effective in relieving the siege of Amelie, and of course Australia was involved in humanitarian airdrops to both of those locations. US airstrikes have broken the ISIL advance into the Kurdish areas. Airstrikes may not roll back their existing conquests, but airstrikes can certainly prevent or hinder, very substantially hinder, new conquests, and this is why I think that the world should be grateful to President Obama for taking the action that he has. He hasn't been trigger happy. He hasn't rushed in. He has been very careful about this, and I think that's to his credit, Alan, because the last thing any of us should want to do is rush into a difficult conflict in the Middle East. By the same token, none of us should want to stand by while an avoidable, preventable genocide takes place, and that's why I think President Obama's actions have been wise and just.
Yes, you said yesterday in the Parliament you wanted us to be prudent and proportionate, and you made it quite clear that you had no intention, your words, to commit combat troops on the ground.
Yep.
Rather than stick people on the ground, I mean, the thing here, I suppose, which is a bit of a plus, is that this crowd, IS, Islamic State, have no air or navy power, do they? But the trouble is, of course, they have now moved themselves into urban areas, and that's the problem. And therefore, if you strike them from the air, there's a risk of civilian casualties. How do you coordinate the operations, but it's an awful word to use, to kill their leadership?
Well, you're right, Alan. These are dire and dreadful things that we are discussing, but sadly, sometimes dire and dreadful measures are necessary in response to the pure evil that we are now seeing across large swathes of the Middle East, thanks to this hideous movement. And the difficulty here is that these people do exult in death. They absolutely revel in killing. We've seen in the century just gone the most unspeakable things happen, but the atrocities that were committed by the Nazis, by the communists and others, they were ashamed of them. They tried to cover them up. This mob, by contrast, as soon as they've done something gruesome and ghastly and unspeakable, they're advertising it on the internet for all to see, which makes them, in my mind, nothing but a death cult, and that's why I think it's quite proper to respond with extreme force against people like this.
Yes, you said yesterday, you made that comment yesterday in the Parliament that it's understandable, I think your words were, that many Australians will shrink from reaching out to this conflict on the other side of the world, but you said this conflict is reaching out to us.
And we've got at least 60 Australians, nearly all of them Australian born and bred, who are participating in this conflict as fighters. We've seen a number of individuals, Australians, posting the most gruesome images of themselves involved in executions, involved in various barbaric acts, and people like this, they have come to hate everyone who doesn't share their particular predilections about God and religion and a way of life, and this is why they are an absolute menace.
So if those people of ours, and you made that statement in the Parliament yesterday, you said at least 60 Australians are fighting with terrorist groups across Iraq and Syria, and they're supported by about 100 more. If these people are disposed to return to Australia, will you be allowing them to return to Australia, and what will happen when they get here?
We can't stop Australian citizens from returning to our country, but if they have been involved in this kind of activity, our absolute intention is to detain them, to prosecute them, to jail them, to keep them off the streets, because people who will kill without compunction abroad are hardly going to be model citizens at home.
You made that yesterday. You said your words, the Prime Minister's words yesterday were around two-thirds of Australians who returned from fighting with terrorist groups in Afghanistan a decade ago subsequently became involved in terrorist activities here. Just in relation to this Australian C-130 Hercules transport aircraft, which has come under fire from Islamic militants during a humanitarian mission over Iraq, what's the latest on that?
Well, I have no advice to that effect. I've seen the report in the paper, and yes, they were flying into an active combat zone, so there may well have been fire in the area, but I'm not advised that they came under direct fire themselves.
Isn't it true that our military aircraft nonetheless are fitted with effective missile countermeasures?
Look, you would hope that they don't come under attack.
That's right.
Yes, they do have, those aircraft do have missile countermeasures. There's no perfect countermeasure to an attack, and different kinds of missiles have different capabilities, but we have carefully assessed the risks. Obviously, flying into a war zone, combat zones, airdrops, even humanitarian airdrops into combat zones are full of risk, but the risks are reasonable given the importance of the missions they're flying.
PM, is there a risk in justification for action being expressed purely in humanitarian terms? I mean, this really is a war. It's an attack on our values, on our way of life, by people, as you've already said this morning here and in the Parliament yesterday, who hate the West. Does your intelligence tell you that there are pockets of Australians being radicalised here and recruited here to join IS?
There's no doubt there are pockets of this kind of activity, and that's why we have an organisation called ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, which works with the state and federal police forces to monitor and deter and disrupt any activity of this nature.
So why then wouldn't you treat jihadis in this country the same way as we treat bikie motorcycle gangs? I mean, they are outlawed. Why wouldn't this lot be another criminal enterprise? Why should these fanatics and extremists, why shouldn't they be outlawed gangs just like we've outlawed motorcycle gangs? Aren't there prayer halls the equivalent of the bikies' chapter clubhouses?
Well, Alan, look, anyone who is involved in criminal activity or potential criminal activity, and terrorism is criminal activity of a particularly heinous type. Anyone who is involved in this kind of activity or is plotting this kind of activity is monitored and disrupted and prosecuted and jailed with all the vigour we can muster This is why we've just put an extra $630 million into our various security agencies, because this is a real threat. It is a very real threat. There were 4 terrorist plots of considerable potential for mass casualties that have already been uncovered over the last few years, and we're on the job, Alan.
Good on you. After your predecessors, of course, completely wound back funding for that specific purpose. PM, thank you for your time, and may I thank you on behalf of millions of Australians for the work you and your team are doing. It's much appreciated.
Thanks so much, Alan.